So just confirming, hopefully, that people online can hear me as well. Or do I need to stand near the desk? Radio silence. Yeah, I can confirm I'm on the screen light there. So I'll start by saying thank you so much for having me. I got to hear the introductions to some of the new PhD students. Congrats on your journey. I'm actually WA born and bred, and I was exiled to Tasmania for 12 years. Came back with a PhD though, so that's, you know. So yeah, I'm a postdoc for all intents and purposes. I work in both the resource and environmental space, and I'm exposed to some of the interesting politics of oil and gas. So to save my moral compass, I like to talk about environmental issues. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Now this project is a work in progress, so I'm really keen to hear some feedback, some thoughts about not necessarily a new methodology, but a new way that we can think about analysing our data. A lot of people in the room developing surveys, estimating discrete choice experiments, continued evaluation, travel cost, etc. But we collect a lot of data. And what can we use with that data? Of course, it's about that message that we want to get out in our journal articles, project reports, etc. And this paper is an application to that, but it has evolved a bit. Since a month ago, I was asked to give a title, and I thought, oh, procedural justice and affinity. The affinity story is still there, so how you identify with particular groups. But in terms of procedural justice, it's probably more to say about fairness, and that'll hopefully become a bit clearer when we talk about water. So we're going to be talking about water policy. It's contentious anywhere you go, but especially in Australia. It is, of course, you may have heard yesterday, the Victorian government has told the federal government, we're not going to meet our efficiency targets. So there are implications there about water buybacks, the government buying water off of irrigators and some of the politics surrounding that. So it is a very contentious issue, but more often than not, it is one that is described as the environment versus irrigators. So in Australia, we have a lot of crops which are very water intensive. Okay, and I have some stats I can talk about shortly. And that's all well and good in the short term, but of course the environment is a longer term problem, and we need to think about how we best manage that water. Okay, so you can see, and I'll talk about some of the papers that talk about this framing and understanding attitudes about how we allocate water. But one area I'd like to look at today is what do households think? What do households think? So we call them respondents in the survey, but those who are giving their preferences for how water should be reallocated. Is it simply a case of supporting irrigators for the environment, or is there more nuance to that? Now, a little bit of a rhetorical question. I think there is, yes, there is a bit more to that debate. So this work is extending the work of Jackson et al., my co-authors, who looked to look at what is in effect a best-worst scaling case one, and then applying a hybrid choice model framework to understand what are some of the attitudes driving particular rankings for different water uses. That is the pitch of this today. It is a work in progress. The policy implications, I'm kind of still fermenting at the moment, but it's looking at whether or not does efficiency matter, so just market solving the problem. Does it matter about fairness and equity, especially when we talk about water allocations for Indigenous communities? Okay, so it's a complex issue, and I'm just looking at a subset of that problem. So this is a reminder for those of you who haven't read the Jackson et al. Paper. So it was about identifying public attitudes, willingness to pay through contingent evaluation for a fairer allocation of water between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So it's contingent valuation. We're using data from the same survey, but some of the key findings here, about 70% of households supported reallocating a very small percentage of water to Indigenous Australians via the water market. So that's for culturally important water holes, etc. And they found that estimated about $21.78 per household. And when you extrapolate that up, whatever techniques was used, that $75 million was the value of that water being reallocated. So we're going to use that same data set, about 2,700 observations, and we're going to use some of that data to look at household priorities for allocating water. Okay, so and think, well, what are some of the attitudes? Not to imply we've captured all of the attitudes. I'm going to talk about that more at the end. So just a few papers here, some recent papers looking at the different issues of this. So it is about competing trade-offs. We have different uses for water. So we've got irrigators, we've got livestock, we've got towns, and cities, of course, need drinking water. We've got water for the environment, water for economic activities. So mining uses quite a bit of water. Surprisingly, oil and gas uses a lot of water. They pump back into the ground and get the gas up, as well as just factories, etc., for heating and cooling. Okay, so there's lots of competing uses for water. So how do we allocate that water? Do we simply go by whoever's willing to pay the most for it? Well, probably not. That's definitely part of the story. But we're trying to essentially manage these water systems, which are both dynamic and stochastic. Okay, so there's uncertainty inherent in it. What can we do? How can we best manage that water? So I know I'm being a little bit repetitive here, but there are quite a few papers that look at these different issues, looking at efficiency versus equity, fairness, etc. Now, there has been some papers looking at particular attitudes and preferences for different water uses. So we've got Graham 2009 and Wheeler et al. But those papers tend to focus on irrigators. So irrigators' perceptions of climate change and whether or not that will influence their decisions with regards to their irrigation decisions, how much water to draw out of the system, their crop choices, etc. There is also Laston and Santelman and Mapaza et al. Looking at some of the issues regarding proximity. Simple question of, are you close to a water source? Do you care more about it being preserved? Okay, so that proximity argument. And we're looking a little bit at that today, actually. We're looking at affinity, which I will describe as your degree of closeness to particular user groups. So we had, I think, 9 user groups, and we've condensed it down into clusters of groups where people have an affinity for. So I'll talk more about those shortly, but we've also got a set of questions looking at what I would describe more so procedural fairness. So people's perception that the process for determining how water be allocated is fair. Okay, so it's the means to allocate water, not necessarily the ends, distributive justice element to it. That's why I've knocked out the distributive, because, and there may be some disagreement in the room, the statements, I don't believe, aspire to anything related to distributive fairness, but I'm happy to hear those thoughts. As I've said, this is a work in progress. So a little bit more about the Murray-Darling Basin for those who are unaware. It is a massive system, and water starts all the way up in Queensland, finds its way through the various complex water systems and rivers, all the way down, coming out near the Coorong, so just south of Adelaide. Okay, this water, of course, crosses several boundaries, okay, state boundaries. So that's where a lot of politics comes into it. Each of the states and territories want as much water as possible for their own economic use, and of course, keeping people alive through supplying water. But there are competing interests. I haven't overlaid where all of the different industries are, but irrigated agriculture, 90% of the water consumed. Okay, it is a lot. There is some mining, but that makes a very small percentage, also up towards New South Wales. Now there is some issues with cultural flows, so that's water being available for Indigenous communities. Originally, their rights were just completely ignored. Okay, that's part of the broader issue with Indigenous rights in this country. But there has been changes to that, and there's a lot of active research. I know Sue Jackson spends a lot of time thinking about this area. How do we allocate water that's fairer to Indigenous communities? But that's a little bit outside of scope of what I'm looking at today. But here is what the system looks like. That's where most of the water goes, but of course the water is also needed for other uses. So a little bit more about my methods. Like I've alluded to, this survey was created through focus groups, gone through the usual process, focus groups and the pilot study, eventually going up online. And it had 6 key sections. So it had a bit of a warm-up about some of the issues there, and of course this was not too long after the Millennium Drought, within 10 years of the Millennium Drought. For those who are not aware, that is where the Murray-Darling Basin didn't completely dry up, but there were parts that did dry up. And for example, the water supply in Victoria got down to 20%. Okay, and the level of water restrictions in Adelaide, it was the highest level. You weren't allowed to water your lawn, you weren't allowed to do anything. Okay, so the Millennium Drought was a severe instance where we almost just completely ran out of water in the system. Okay, so that's not the world we're living in right now, though, funnily enough. There's quite a bit of water at the moment. If you look around, for example, the Victorian desal plant, 190 gigalitres of water. Next year, the Water Minister has asked for 0 litres, because there's plenty of water at the moment. But as we know, plenty of smart people in this room, we're not always going to have a lot of water, and managing that dynamic, stochastic nature is a key priority here. Okay, so we did ask about the Millennium Drought, the familiarity of the Murray-Darling Basin, did you boat, fish, etc. We also asked some best, worst questions, so that's the case one example I'll talk about in detail shortly. We had the contingent valuation questions, but that was the subject of the 2019 paper. We also had some questions looking at procedural fairness, as well as proximity to different water using groups, as well as our socio-demographic questions. So the survey went live in 2017. I believe I was a research assistant and did the best worst, so I can hold my hand to that one. But we had about 2,699 responses in total. So quite a healthy data set for being able to look at different cohorts. Okay, so best worst case one. On the right-hand side of the diagram, these were the different uses of water. So we've got the environment, agriculture, stock animals, mining, Aboriginal cultural use, towns and cities, and businesses and factories. This was the question, okay? So thinking about the Murray-Darling Basin, we would like you to think about how water should be used over the next 10 years, okay? So we have a current allocation at the time of survey, what should be the priorities, okay? And this was households being asked this question. So we had a balanced incomplete block design. We had 7, so we had 7 statements, lots of 3. So we basically asked 7 times with order randomized, what did you pick as best and what would you pick as worst? Okay, so these were the best, worst questions. This is the key data that we're analyzing. Okay, and I'll show you the result of this. You can do a very simple choice model estimation and you can see the relative rankings. Okay, but of course that's just a simple analysis. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to show you how you could potentially extend this analysis to dig down, because you can calculate averages. Okay, so just for context, with best worst, if you're going to estimate this as a choice model, to avoid the dummy variable trap, you have to set one of the levels to 0. We selected mining. Okay, so I'll repeat that a few times throughout. Mining is the base level, so we're comparing the relative rankings for each of these against mining. Okay, so what does a hybrid choice model look like? So if you ignore the right-hand side of the diagram, you've just got the standard best worst model. You can do simple count data analysis. You can do estimate using the techniques talked about in Louvier et al. You can talk about estimating and essentially an MNL for this. But what we've got here is the combination. We're going to go a little bit further than this. What we're going to essentially do is try to account for these latent variables influencing the relative rankings for each of these alternatives. Now, the trouble with latent variables is, well, they're latent. They're not directly observable. It's like asking someone's age, education, and getting that data. You have to infer it from, in this case, a set of responses to Likert scale questions. Okay, so we've got this framework where we're simultaneously using a latent variable, which is a function of socio-demographic characteristics, and this latent variable will simultaneously predict responses to a set of Likert scale questions, which we believe represent particular latent variables, as well as the latent variable explaining relative differences in the rankings of each of these alternatives. Okay, so that's the high-level diagram. Everyone has their versions. I'm not a graphic design artist, so I go for the quite utilitarian version. But that is, you can see these different kind of versions. Happy to provide examples of some more comprehensive ones. I try to keep this quite simplistic. So before I go any further, what are our respondent attributes which form up part of the latent variable? So we've got age both and with linear quadratic, so age and age squared. We've got gender, 1 equal female. We've got a low income variable, dummy variable. Actually, sorry, some of these were effects coded. We have education, where we had high school year 12 as the base. And then we're comparing above and below that. We've got whether or not the person lived in the city or not, whether or not they visited Murray-Darling Basin, whether or not the person lived in South Australia. Now, why South Australia, not everyone else? Or when we actually did the segment analysis looking at the best worst rankings, there was a difference in South Australia. Now, that difference we're capturing with this variable, but it's probably a proxy for something else. Okay, so just, of course, we're doing the best we can here. And whether or not they were affected by the Millennium Drought. Okay, so we've got a latent variable. A latent variable is essentially a function of those things, simultaneously predicts responses to a set of Likert questions, as well as the relative rankings. very quickly, because I've got to have a bit of econometrics in here. So it is, of course, random utility maximisation. A whole bunch of PhD students here doing discrete choice, so it's hopefully nothing new for you. Looking at the best-worst scaling, it's a little bit different from your standard choice model. What you essentially do, you've got two pairs being compared. So respondent I is comparing pair J and K, so the environment and agriculture. And what we're saying is the utility function for that pair can be expressed as a function of the estimated parameters for each of the alternatives. We code the best choice as 1 and the worst choice as a -1. That's if the choice model can actually solve. And of course, we have our extreme value type 1 error terms. Now, in this approach, we've actually gone a step to extend, because as we know, MNL is a great to start off with, but we like to account for preference and heterogeneity. So I've chosen random parameters. You could just as easily do this with blank class, happy to talk about that, but we've chosen a random parameters. So we're not just estimating a mean ranking, we're actually calculating a distribution. So we've got our mean, standard deviation, standard normal distribution is the assumption for what that distribution looks like, and a set of interaction terms, which makes the analysis a little bit trickier, but these interactions are going to capture each of the n latent variables. We have 4 today that we're going to consider, okay? So that is what the best-worst model looks like, just on the left-hand side, random parameters, then we account for that latent variable. So the maximum likelihood estimation is going to try and find a set of parameters that best fits the data based on this specification. But we've also got a structural and indicator function. So the structural equation, this links the socio-demographics to each of the latent variables. And we've also got a set of indicator functions, which of course, if you've done any ordinal regression, you'll hopefully see a familiar patterns, estimating n-1 taus for your different levels. So we have Likert scale questions, 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree. So we're essentially trying to use these socio-demographics, which represent a latent variable, to predict certain responses to each of the statements, but as well the relative rankings through the interactions in the best-worst model. Does have to be simulated. 2,500 ml HES draws, still looking at the stability of the parameter estimates. Unfortunately, these models take a very long time to solve. I'm not talking days, I'm talking weeks and months. So if you're going to ask me to run one today, it's a polite no, okay? Happy to take suggestions though. So talking a little bit about the factor analysis, because we had all these statements, but how do we, what do we do with these statements? How do we actually cluster them together? Because we actually assume these latent variables are independent of each other, okay? And one way you can do that is through factor analysis. So you take, in this case, we had our 9 user groups. We applied factor analysis, and we essentially have found affinity for 2 groups. We found affinity for what I'm calling consumption groups. I'm happy to discuss whether that's an appropriate label, but this group, there's a set of response patterns to the Likert scales where people really care about or have strong affinity for irrigators, mining, business, and rural drylands. So I see that as direct economic uses, okay? There's affinity for those groups where there are the water is being part of feedstock being used to produce another product. There is this second affinity group, and this group here, it is a much smaller group, I'll point out. They have an affinity for environmental or conservation groups, as well as Aboriginal water users. Okay, so factor analysis was used to glean them out. The other factors, the factor loadings, which is not worth looking at, and we do of course need to care about the reliability of these things. So, of these factors, I should say. So these are 2 of the 4 latent variables: affinity for consumption groups, affinity for environmental groups. So that's 2 of the 4. We have 2 more. Like I said, we had, I didn't say how many statements. We had 16 statements looking at fairness. We broke those down into 2 groups. What I'm calling water fairness and water concern. So to understand what these latent variables mean, looking at this first group, as the latent variable goes up in value, the likelihood of agreeing with these statements also goes up, okay? So someone who really cares about water fairness are going to strongly agree with these statements. It is not right for people to go short of water in this country. Community welfare is the most important concern for water planning, okay? Decisions about water made today should try to be fair to people who have not had water rights in the past. Now, part of the I won't call it the art, part of the method of using these hybrid choice models to identify these latent variables. What do you call them? So I'm calling this a concern about water fairness, okay? Is it procedural justice? Depends how far you want to dig yourself procedural fairness into the sand about the topic. I believe this is a measure of fairness. Is it the only one? No, but that's what I'm calling it today. There is a second group, water concern. So what do these people agree about? Well, they think that too much free water has been given to irrigators in the past, just way too much. Okay, they're aware that there's plenty of lobbying going on within the Murray-Darling Basin. They're aware there's a lot of concern, and we've reversed these statements, so I'll spend a bit of time here. Water allocations aren't important to me. We've reversed that, so for this group, they actually are important for this group. And as well, the government has allocated too much water to the environment. Reverse that, they haven't allocated enough water to the environment. Okay, so there's my choices for water concern, water fairness. Happy to discuss what those labels mean a little bit later on, but we're really well and truly into the results now. Okay, so if you look at the first two columns and ignore the hybrid model, you're seeing the relative rankings, and this is a result in itself. As you can see, I've almost ordered them from what's most important to least important with a little bit of a variation. What's most important? Critical human needs. Town water. People want water allocated first to towns and cities. It's a real, for me, it's quite intuitive that they want to have drinking water, okay? Unrestricted access to drinking water. Next, they care about the environment. In this survey, they did care about the environment, allocating water to the environment. Next, it is followed by our agricultural uses, so irrigation and stock animals. Observing the standard errors, they're fairly close, okay? Those priorities. Of course, remember this is always measured relative to mining, so mining is set to 0, just for identification. So following irrigated agriculture, we then go to Aboriginal cultural use and water for businesses and factories. Okay, so they are the lower end of the priorities. Now that's the simple M&L model. There's nothing else going on there. There's no random parameters, that's just the simple ranking. So I think that's an important story there in itself, but that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to go a bit further. So now if you look at the hybrid model, things get a little bit confusing because you see water for towns and cities has shot up. Water for Aboriginal cultural use is negative, which implies that they rank water for Indigenous cultural use, Aboriginal cultural use lower than mining. So that would be an erroneous interpretation. Okay? To interpret the means in a hybrid choice model, you're interpreting those means when the interactions are 0, which in effect means when the latent variables are set to 0. Remember, our latent variables are a function of sociodemographics. So that's someone with no gender, no education, no age. Okay? So I just want to hazard a little bit of a warning when it comes to looking at these models. Definitely through the journal process, we've had to really spend a lot of time explaining this because these are a little bit more complex models. So the means on their own, not particularly useful, okay? They're just not. If you really want to understand a particular individual's relative ranking, you'll need to simulate the latent variable, okay? And when you simulate the latent variable for the entire sample, what do you get? Although I haven't shown it here, it's something very similar to these rankings, okay? The hybrid choice model is not necessarily about changing the relative rankings. It's about understanding what's driving differences in rankings at the individual level, okay? So standard deviations, standard random parameters, there's heterogeneity, we can simulate distributions and see that for some individuals, environment's last and agriculture's first, etc. Okay? The interactions is where things get a little bit interesting, okay? Well, I think they do so anyway. So we've made choices to only interact some latent variables with some of the levels. Happy to hear feedback from the group, but affinity 1, we've gone against stock animals, irrigated agriculture, and businesses and factories. And we've essentially confirmed what I've kind of alluded to earlier. If people have a strong affinity for these consumption groups, they're going to rank these alternatives relatively higher, okay? So that's one finding in itself. Now, when it comes to the environment, they're going to, relatively speaking, rank the environment higher. Stock animals, we thought there may be an environmental dimension, ethical farming, etc., but not only significant at 10%. So treating that as a non-significant finding, that's what the red findings are, the red numbers are. And in terms of cultural use, yes. If you have a strong affinity for this second group, you're going to rank it higher. Okay. When it comes to the fairness story, not as clear in terms of statistical significance. People who care about fairness, they really do care about allocating water for towns and cities. Not so much for the environment though, not significant at all. Cultural use, yes, maybe a statistical power problem, but only significant at 10%. And then finally, for concern, we are seeing those who are really concerned about water, they're allocating more water to towns and cities, or ranking that alternative relatively higher, as well as water for the environment. Whereas for irrigated agriculture, we're not seeing anything come through. Okay, so that's that left-hand side of the diagram I was talking about, that the best-worst model with this random parameter specification and the interactions. Now, I did reverse some of these to make things a little bit easier. That's probably more of a programming issue. And as a reminder, mining use was the base level. Now to talk about structural equations. This is where I wouldn't say the wheels fall off, but there is no guidance as far as I'm aware in the literature as to what sociodemographics you include in these models. There are people who advocate for just throwing your entire survey into it. And of course, you do have multicollinearity issues you may run into, okay? So that, I believe, is part of the gap in the literature, but nonetheless, we had a bunch of variables added in. You can see the significance does vary quite a bit, okay? Statistical significance. This is quite a common thing that happens in these models, especially once you have multiple latent variables coming through. How do you get around this? Well, I think my belief is it's the strength of your factor analysis, looking at the internal reliability of those factors, really making sure there is no correlation between those factors. Okay, but that would involve designing a set of statements and then doing that analysis, which psychologists are really good at, but as an economist, I have no idea how to do. My default, and what I see a lot of people do, is they hypothesize about things like environmental protection, influencing preferences, and they go find a set of scales out that exist in the literature. Okay, then they retest those scales. So you can see I don't want to spend too much time here beyond highlighting that if you really want to get the rankings for the average, you need to simulate across the and get your minimum, average, and maximum. Noting that for concern, it does become negative. So if you really don't have a concern for the environment at all, it'll actually lower your relative rankings for the last attribute, the last interactions. So water for towns and cities, not a concern. Water for the environment, not a concern. Ignore agriculture because the lack of statistical significance. Now I have got a set of results that look at the interactions against the measurement equations. They're all statistically significant. They're quite mechanistic. How do you interpret them? Happy to show them as part of the appendix, but essentially as the latent variables increase in value, the probability that someone's going to agree with the set of statements goes up. Okay, so that's the interpretation there, but generally they're not the main area of concern. It's those interactions we want to care about. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. Probably gone through this way too quickly. But now I get to the discussion part. So what have we really found here beyond demonstrating an application of hybrid choice models in best worst case one? Well, the interpretation that we're working with at the moment is that it's not so simple as an irrigators versus the environment argument. I'm sure a lot of people in the room know that, okay? But what we're doing is just trying to understand, we're thinking about water allocation decisions. They involve society. They involve numerous stakeholders with competing interests. Households are one of those interests, okay? So the argument I'm making here today is that critical human needs come first, okay? So there may be a policy implication there about messaging when we're talking to communities about water, okay? So is it about, first and foremost, easing their minds about, yes, there's enough water for towns, okay, yes, we've done enough here, let's focus on these other issues potentially, okay? Then of course comes the environment. Now, looking at older papers, it's great to see this is going a little bit higher up the rankings. People are becoming aware. And they are aware, of course, after the drought within 10 years. An interesting project we're working on right now is to actually retest this and see, now that we're in a world of water abundance, have these rankings changed, okay? Especially my work in the hydrogen economy, where we're going to need a lot more water for another use soon. It's interesting to think about how these preferences update. So following the environment, it is your irrigation and food production story. Whereas Indigenous cultural use and other economic uses, lie lower down, which I found quite interesting because if you thought about it in terms of economic value, that first litre of water, where does it go? It goes to where the most marginal benefit can be accrued to it. Well, if we think about our economic activities and their contribution to GDP, it's mining. Water goes to mining first, and oil and gas, because that's how we get mining royalties. It's what keeps the state alive and the rest of the country. But that's not what households are. Okay? They don't care about that. They care about drinking water. They care about food production. And they also care about the environment. But we've also, at least in this preliminary analysis, tried to understand what's driving those rankings. What is driving those rankings? The argument I'm making here is that it may be the case that it's affinity for these particular groups. And that perhaps is not too surprising given that, well, think about the political process, people politically lobby based on user groups. So they're kind of not exactly synonymous finding, but there is some comparison to be made there. And as well, attitudes towards fairness and concern, they do matter, okay? Well, there's evidence to suggest they may matter. I'll be a bit more conservative in what I'm saying here. They may matter. Now, as to what are the policy implications of fairness and water concern, well, this paper on its own, it's one study, but there is a lot of talk now in terms of water governance and about being better at how we set up water policy. Again, going back to what was the key point of my talk at the beginning, efficiency versus equity versus fairness, what are the priorities? Okay. At the end of the day, we have government processes, public servants working through on behalf of voters, designing policy that is in voters' best interest. And it may be that accounting for fairness and concern or addressing those issues may lead to better outcomes in terms of water governance and water policy. So that's where I will end it. I've got some references back for those who want to look at certain papers I've cited, as well as the appendix of the measurement equations. So again, thank you so much everyone coming along today, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. We have several minutes for Q&A, so we can start from Michael.
Yeah. Could you go back to the questions that we used to define affinity?
Yes. Yeah, there we are, those ones there.
So it just looks as if those are almost the same questions that you asked in the best worst. So it's something it's not surprising that with people giving you those high values for those affinity questions, that they then got. So it's sort of the problem of your attitudinal variable is essentially your variable of interest just re-expressed. So is it possible to, so I'm sort of questioning as to whether the affinity thing is just as clear as you're saying, or is it just reproducing the result? I'm reproducing the best worst question, essentially.
Yeah, something we're thinking about. So this affinity work comes out of some old work from Jeff Syme and co, and he was looking at affinity in different applications. And he was essentially finding a very similar result, that I can't talk to the specifics of their papers and their comparison. It is an interesting thought, yeah, like it's almost like endogeneity kind of problem here. And that's a key learning, I guess, from these hybrid choice models. You are assuming the direction goes one way. And I think, yeah, Michael, I think it's a great point. I think we've had to reflect a little bit more upon the sense of the best worst influencing the affinity, or if the affinity is influencing the best worst. I mean, we could, one way to do it is to change the order in the survey, but I think it's probably something a bit more fundamental that needs to be kind of cleaned out a bit there.
The other one, I think the next step, I think the ones on the next slide, I think look distinctly different in the sense it's about these high level questions about my attitude to fairness and concern.
Yeah.
Then you think, okay, well, those are genuinely predicting which industries I'm going for. So I think those didn't jump out at me, but the first one sort of this looks endogenous.
Yeah, so that it may be in a future work a better match for affinity where the correlation between the best worst and the affinity isn't so ingrained. Right. I mean, I could probably do some basic analysis and see the correlations to response to data, get a degree of linearity. So thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering what the choice experiment question is really getting out of your respondents. Mm-hmm. If you ask me as a respondent, what's what's the highest priority for the first megalitre of water, then I probably would say cities.
Yep.
But if you said which user of water should get the most water in an average year, I might say agriculture.
So it's about the framing of the question.
Yeah, what is the question actually asking about? I didn't pick that up as you went through.
Yeah, so that's why I had the question up here as that I can't go any going to be able to give you literal statement. Okay. So this is a best worst ranking conditional on this statement. So most favourable water use, least favourable water use over the next
how
10
water
years.
should be used.
Yeah, how water should.
So do you think that's getting it a mark? So when you talked about it, you tended to express it as like a marginal value. But when I read that, it doesn't necessarily get that. It's fairly general, isn't it, how water should be used?
Yeah, and I completely concede there are different ways to answer this question, some better and some worse. The marginal, that's the economist in me really coming out and trying to frame these issues. But households don't think about those marginal kind of issues. They don't think about the first litre. They think in a much more holistic sense about their priorities. So,
but they might if you ask them about it specifically. Like if you said there's a terrible drought, there's not much water, who gets it?
Yeah.
They could probably answer that.
So here's a megalitre in a town, where should that megalitre go?
Yeah.
And yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not we get the same results. So I completely concede that these results are conditional on this framing, and it'd be an interesting follow-up to see whether or not a slightly different framing, those marginal senses, would you actually get the same result? So thank you for the suggestion.
So I actually agree with Dave there. The framing is important. Yeah. The other thing also is that, the year the research was conducted, because if it was a drought year, the response would be actually influenced. So I'm glad to hear that you're planning to repeat this.
Yeah, I mean, it was a few years after the drought, but yeah, like people's memories in these communities, they last a long time. Yeah, so I can see that.
Can you go back to your slide with that model, the variables that you have? Yes, that one. Yeah, so in terms of your that latent variable model, did you actually look at the effect of employment or occupation? Because, for example, if they are working in a particular industry, that might influence their choice.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, again, the literature doesn't tell you what to put in there. It just doesn't. It takes forums like this to kind of get a sense of what we should and shouldn't. So I'd have to go back to the survey and see what those questions are. But yes, I think just more broadly, I guess, hinting at my research interest, I think we can do a lot better with this. I think there is value in, if you get every other part of the survey right, I think there's a lot of insights to be gleaned, but figuring out what to put here is tricky. The framework is great, but it can always be better. So I'll go, short answers I'll check, and then when I can dare to run this model again, I'll have them in. It's about a month. So yeah, there's an opportunity cost when you've got another model projects going. So and I'm yet to get into the supercomputer work. Yeah, I just don't know if I can sell this.
Okay, thank you. My question is regarding to that question on water for Aboriginal cultural use. What is that? Because if I look at your definition, I see apart from where you say for cultural values, there is the portion where you talk about businesses for use in business and also for the environment.
Yeah.
Which I think is also being picked by the other question when you're asking about, what is the water for the environment, water for business and factory use. So I wasn't sure what is
yes.
then covering. Yeah. And the other question that I had is looking at just the water that is being used. Do you have any figures on what is the proportion of water that is being used, let's say, for what you call the Aboriginal cultural use in service?
I'll answer, I can answer the second first, less than 1%. It's a very small. So water is culturally sensitive. We talk about culturally important water holes, where there are places of spiritual importance, connection to the dream time. And it's where these communities, the absence of the water and the cycle of water essentially tells a story. And these areas are quite small, but they are culturally significant. So it's not about economics from their perspective. It's about the connection to dream time and having water in perpetual. So the earlier work Jackson et al. Kind of points out, does a lot of things I'm not going to talk about today, but it points out people are willing to allocate a very, very small sliver of water.
So is this something that the respondents are aware of about?
Yeah, in the best worst, you got to be careful, of course, with best worst. I probably didn't explain it very well. Before the questions came up, there was about half a page description, but it's very much trying to stick to the facts because you don't want to condition people based on the information. So it's a real tough one to figure out because you want people's preferences at that time, not conditional in the survey. What role does information play in surveys? Like an active area we're looking at. So yeah.
This last question, in your structural equation model, I didn't get clear what's the hypothesis, what are you trying to, what's the theory that you're trying to look at?
So we're just trying to understand
structural.
Yes. Yeah, this is where there's structural models in one part of the literature and the structural models in choice experiments. I'm hoping I'm not making it more confusing and delineating the two. So the idea is that we have a function for the latent. The latent variable is a variable in itself, which then gets interacted within the indicator functions and the choice model itself, the best worst model. You can see it there, but because it is a latent variable, we proxy it as being a function of a set of socio-demographic characteristics. So you've got an estimate of the socio-demographic characteristics as variables, set of parameters, which then you can use with the error term appropriately identified to create this exogenous variable, the latent variable, which then gets included in the other models. Yeah.
Mark, may I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
Yes, yeah.
Tefes? Is that all right, Tefes? Can I ask?
Yes.
Thanks. Oh, sorry. Mark, thank you very much.
Sure, let's go.
Coming out here.
I know, I used to.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Yep,
Testing. Is that all right? Is that better?
That's right.
Thanks. Okay. In relation to your latent variables and the ranking, in particular in relation to agricultural land, what really struck me was that there seemed to be an implicit assumption that that there were ethical issues that stood above the agricultural land. And if you imagine Australian agriculture simply not happening, there would be the minor matter of the rest of the world going hungry, which doesn't seem to have entered into the ethical ranking consideration. It was as if the community was only thinking about itself and not thinking about the outside world. It's just an observation, really. I'm sure that genuinely does seem to be the case. But if you were looking at this from a global perspective and you had a global panel of citizens making the same decisions rather than a local panel of decision makers, I suspect they'd come to a very, very different set of rankings.
No, thank you. I'll try and paraphrase the rest of the room. So it's about the ethics of the ranking, the environment and agriculture. And of course, agriculture in Australia is largely an export market. We don't consume a lot of the agricultural products produced domestically. And the question is whether or not these rankings would be the same from an ethical perspective when you consider domestic versus international. And we didn't talk about it in terms of export. So that's potentially a limitation, acknowledge that. And it would be an interesting extension to think about this from global citizens' perspectives in different countries, looking at these relative rankings and seeing, even just looking at Australians when we talk about the export perspective, whether or not the rankings would change. So thank you for the suggestion.
That's all.
Right. I think we have also a question from Steve. Steve, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. I don't know whether you said this, but I was wondering whether in your analysis there appeared relationships between the rankings and specific social groups, if you categorize your social groups. That was one question I had. The last comment by Julian made me think of the fact that what would be probably more interesting than looking at specific rankings given your approach, is to identify what factors the rankings respond to. So what makes the rankings change, which would give us a deeper understanding of what's determining those rankings. So that this ranking, it's a bit like one data point in a way.
Okay. Yeah, I think I answer the best as I can. I think there's.
What's the question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase the question.
Quite short.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I got that. I was wondering if you could add it in the end.
Yeah, I can read. I can read.
I'll go and bring it back.
I think Steve is saying, not sure you said this. I missed the start.
Yes, it's a relationship between the rankings and the social groups. So another way you can do this is with relate class models and start to think about different classes. Each class will have its own unique ranking, and then you can try and link some socio-demographics or even the latent variables. So the random parameters kind of assumes there's a whole distribution, and then you add a whole bunch of interactions, and the interactions can represent social groups, or they can just represent core socio-demographic characteristics. That's the approach I've opted for. And you talk to different people, you're going to get different answers about what's the preferred approach, both econometrically as well as from a policy theoretical understanding. So I'm sorry, that's the best answer I can give. I have run some latent class versions of these models, but I fall into the trap of useless classes once I go through a certain threshold. So definitely more work to do there, and I completely concede, yes. I mean, there's so many things that could influence these rankings, so many things. I mean, if you're a cold-hearted econometrician, you'd say this is just absolute rubbish because of limited variable bias. And I'd say, well, yes, but I'm trying to get on with the job of finding something. So, yeah, I completely concede that, and factoring in different social groups. I mean, I think the affinity is kind of getting to that, but it's confounded. There's other things there. So better affinity group categorization, maybe it's calling it social groups. Maybe it's finding those political lobby groups as to try to measure those. So thank you. I did see there was another question.
There's another question. Yeah. How do you know what the latent values are?
We are inferring based on, and that's probably where I should talk about the results here. We're inferring based on the relationship between the socio-demographics and the probability of agreeing with the sets of statements. So the cluster of statements together are what define what is the latent variable. Now, how do you go a step below that? You go back to the psychological literature where they came up with a set of statements, and they'll make the arguments as to why that is the latent variable. As economists, we're not necessarily psychologists as well, so we take the second best of trying to find statements which we hypothesize represent certain latent variables. I don't know, there was a question here.
Okay, I'm going to transform it, so we're tight for time, into a quick comment, which is, I think affinity is going to be correlated or possibly caused by fairness and concern. For that reason, I also think that there's going to be endogeneity concerns Michael brought up. For that reason, if you estimate it without the affinity variables, I have a feeling concern and fairness are going to have a bigger effect. And I think you're probably going to have a more interesting paper as well. Because I think people are going to care more about how concern and fairness affects results more than, people who support the mining industry think the mining industry should have more water isn't especially interesting, I think. But I think if you talk about fairness and concern more broadly and it's a bit more detached, it'll be a more interesting finding that. And I think those will be significant in all the interactions if you take the affinity out.
It is an assumption that last error term sitting there, the latent variables that are independent, it is an assumption we should test. And I was taught as an undergrad that you don't want to run too many models because then there's a problem with t-tests and what they really represent, but you do want to run a vast set of different models. So we have 3 models, or 4, but the base model, we've got chucking the kitchen sink in, and then we've got testing the 2 sets. But my feedback today is probably not the affinity, at least that there. I think, that's a tough one. I'm going to go back to my co-authors on that one because it is their survey. I am the poor messenger. We are developing the new survey, and I do if I can close it out, so I think we're definitely at time. Thank you so much for the feedback and helping make this what I think is the best paper. I'm happy to chat with any of you about some ideas about how you can use this in your research, because at least in the choice model space, this is the shiny big thing that you can work on. Okay, and I can personally attest that it will get published. So, so thank you. I'm done.